Hello, good morning and welcome. It's 11 a.m. here in Singapore and you're with us live for the latest webinar brought to you by CargoNOW magazine and the Chartered Institute of Logistics and Transport, CILT. My name is Bob Gill, General Manager, Southeast Asia at ARC Advisory Group, and I'm delighted to welcome my co-host today, Dr. Raman Krishnan, who's the Editor-at-Large, CargoNOW, and President of the Logistics and Supply Chain Management Society. Our topic today is Ready to Eat, the Food Supply Chain Risks, Remedies and Resilience. And our two expert guests who will help us illuminate this issue are Ms. Kelly Tan, who is an independent food logistics consultant, and Mr. Tim Foote, who's the owner of SUSYMBIO. Now, I'm sure our audience out there would love to know more about Kelly and more about Tim. So with a nod to today's topic, perhaps you could both share with us your background, experience, and some of the highlights in your career so far. So Kelly.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you for having me back again today. I started my career with DHL, a 3PL. It's a pretty expected route for somebody who wants to go into logistics. And over the years, I had the opportunity to move across industries from 3PL to 4PL to being shippers who buy logistics services, as well as managing the food supply chain. Subsequently, I moved to American MNC, managing the food supply chain for F&B. And my most recent position was in hospitality, also in supply chain for Asia. Today, I'm actually a consultant to SME in the F&B industry specifically.
Okay, thank you. And Tim?
Yeah, my name is Tim Foote. So I've had a career of over 25 years in logistics so far. I started in freight forwarding back in the United States and also moved chemicals in the chemical industry for 5 years before venturing into this new, at that time, e-commerce arena back in 2003 in a company which became actually a DHL e-commerce company. So yeah, Kelly, I'm also from DHL, the DHL school, if you will. So my achievements for me during that time, I think DHL was a great experience because it moved me from Germany and over to Asia over 12 years ago. And the achievements have been really associated with building solutions that provide value for customers in the e-commerce arena as well as in the forwarding and shipping arena. So uniquely, I've been able to as well set up a sustainability program in DHL e-commerce when I was there as well. So I was the head of Go Green there for many years. And since May this year, I've founded my own consulting company, and I've been fortunate since May as well to have started as a moderator for Rural Logistics Working Group, which was set up by Grow Asian World Economic Forum Roundtable. And so I'll be able to really share some of the sharings that we've had there, as well as some of the initiatives that we wanted to start built out of that working group.
All right. Okay. Thank you, Tim, and thank you, Kelly. So let's get into this topic. So consumers probably spend not too much time thinking about where all the food available in Singapore comes from and how it actually gets here. So how complex is this food supply chain? Kelly, perhaps you could take a look at this one.
In the food chain, there are many processes that actually goes into it, but let's try to simplify it for today. I've actually created it into a 10-step cycle. As you can see, as it is, it's probably already complicated enough. A lot of planning have to go into place even before the actual work takes place. And if you look at the screen quickly, you'll see that transport actually appearing multiple times. For the matter of fact that each process cannot coexist in exactly the same location, there's always the transport elements that has to go in place to transport from the first facility to the second facility, where the next process has to go in place, and finally to where the consumers are. And through all these transports, I think the global conditions, the weather conditions, distance, and availability of resources really makes it very complicated. And not forgetting, while doing all this process, we need to ensure that the food is still safe to be eaten.
Okay, thank you.
So borrowing from, just continuing from that, yeah, and also from Tim's introduction. And Tim, this is a question directed at you. So looking upstream, because a lot of us are very familiar with what happens downstream. You know, we go to the supermarket, from your distribution center, delivered to your house, or your wife or you go and shop for it. But looking upstream at farms, at primary production, what can you share with us some of the logistics issues that can impact the reliability of food from food supply to the consumer?
Yeah, well, there's quite a few. Maybe we switch to my slides there. Yeah, for that one. So first of all, yeah, as part of the rural logistics working group that we made, we were actually addressing some of these problems and sharing some of those problems within basically a group which was made up of people from agribusiness, from farmers associations, from transportation companies in Southeast Asia, as well as storage and finance companies as well, even that were looking to get involved with this problem. And what we found was that, you know, in terms of problems, and we can go to the next slide, one of the biggest problems we had, especially during the COVID time, but quite frankly, this is also affecting trade within Southeast Asia already, even prior to COVID time, are to a limited degree, are the regulations from individual governments, which especially during COVID froze essential workers moving and doing their job. So either froze farmers from doing their farming, or froze drivers from picking up food from the farm, warehouse people from going to work in the warehouse. And I believe you've even probably read in reports where you had ports in India that were frozen in terms of moving cargo in and out because all the workers were told to go home. That's kind of the worst case scenario. So this freezing of essential workers from doing their job really became a major problem that was identified. Outside of that as well, we have structures within the food supply chain, which kind of freezes, how do you say, I would say not freezing, but also causes a lot of waste in the food supply chain, especially from the farm to the table, even from the farm to the processing unit. We do have to acknowledge, of course, that ASEAN has varying levels of development when it comes to, you know, countries which are highly developed in terms of transportation and moving food properly. You know, obviously Singapore, we don't really produce much food ourselves, but the little food that we do produce is almost instantly eaten up, you know, locally. So there's not a lot of waste in that system. But when we're dealing with our neighbors, especially larger countries where infrastructure becomes very important, as well as the development there, then we have some serious differences in levels of development. And that was something that we addressed as well, and how to address this difference in development in ASEAN, which are our immediate neighbors and our immediate food sources that are right next door. We also acknowledge the problems of rural transportation, and that has to do with access to suitable trucks, let's say refrigerator trucks if you want to ship perishables, but also times, as Kelly was mentioning, timing of when thing is harvesting. It's dependent on the weather. It's dependent on a lot of other factors. It depends on what farmer decided to grow on his land this year. And so we have all these patterns of you know, when things are growing, but we don't have a lot of truck companies investing to provide transportation services for those rural communities. And, you know, that there's a lot of business arguments probably behind that. And lack of infrastructure, in particular storage, also was a large area where we see waste. That is a lack of, let's say, appropriate storage for, let's say, perishable goods again. For one report I saw from the FAO was acknowledging that in Southeast Asia alone, you see about 20% of food is wasted from the farm to the processing center. So 20% is gone even before it can be put into a can or processed into some kind of food, and which Kelly's, then those companies can do something with it, and Kelly's moving it from there, you know. So that is a lot of waste in the system. And these were even there before COVID, but they're still things that we need to tackle. So some of the outcomes that we decided to focus on as a working group was to focus on recommendations for, again, how to unfreeze the workers so that they can do their job during a time of COVID, as well as how can we make things move quicker or easier between countries within ASEAN, because the focus was very much within ASEAN. So we wanted to maximize that safety for the workers so that they get PPE in the future, they get things to protect them so they don't get sick, so they can show up and do their job and move our food and even harvest our food. So this is really like one of the first outcomes. The second outcome was to try and create a measure so that we can measure what is food resilience. And we have basically about 6 different categories which are defining food resilience for the countries within ASEAN, so that they can see, oh, which countries need improvement in, let's say, cold storage, which countries need rural transport development, which countries need to figure out why things aren't getting to ports on a timely measure, which could allude to more regulations and things like that. So we put together that. And thirdly, next slide, is the innovation challenge, where we said we wanted to get the best minds in IT and maybe the creative minds of younger people involved with trying to solve how to do a better way of transportation organization for rural areas within Southeast Asia. And we wanted to really run a pilot within Indonesia to begin with, where we already had Hada Indonesia, which is an organization in Indonesia which works with farmers. They have thousands of farmers in their database with knowing where they're located, what they grow, and their locations, more important, right? And figure out, if they have that data, can they figure out a better way in which to arrange transportation within a rural community so that more is taken to the processing factory without being wasted or spoiled in the process? And can that be done cheaper? How can they do it to where it's cheaper? And
Right.
we were even looking at how to take that data and then use it for other means, you know, perhaps even moving the processing or some storage units to a more optimal location nearer to where these things are grown.
All right. Thanks for that, Tim.
Yeah.
Okay, so Kelly, you described the food supply chain just now, but I wonder, what are the types of events that can interrupt the smooth flow of that chain and potentially result in what we don't want, which are food shortages?
So actually, there are so many possible things that can go wrong in the food chain. And because of that 10 step that I have said, in each of the steps, there are also different possibilities that things may go wrong. I tried to do a little bit of a spaghetti diagram here, just to simplify, and yet it is indeed a little bit of a complication, and I tried to do a little bit of a color coding. So if we look at it, green, let's take it as a non-food item. So it's all the different type of packaging or machine parts, whatever that needs in support of getting food to where consumers are. A lot of times we have got like MOQ requirements, we have got restrictions in terms of the production capabilities of the factory. And if we move to ambient food chain, yes, those are food, but they do not really need to be referred. A lot of them actually have got very long lead time, and because they are not in the top of the chain, they are really deprioritized in terms of the entire global transport. And if we move to the red alert, which is where the cold chain really is, and that is where all eyes are on, where continuous monitoring has to go in place. If not, something could go wrong. The food could go bad. It could be bad for the people that's eating it. And also maybe the food could just be spoiled, like what Tim mentioned earlier. A lot of these products are highly perishables. Fresh produced fruits and vegetables probably last anything between 7 to 10 days at max, and if they don't reach the mouth of the consumer, that's it, it goes into the dustbin. But it's not just the 3 different type of transport that we are talking about. If only that was so simple. We also have a lot of other requirements that is put into place. For example, we've got cross-border regulations in terms of bringing and sending food in and out of countries. And with globalizations in the last 50 years, we are trying to source from all parts of the world, whatever that is best for the country. So that further complicates the whole situation of the food chain. And of course, not forgetting, we could have things like halal requirements, which is the entire food chain on its own, that has to be separated from the rest of the food chain. And that itself is a complication to bring from the farm all the way to the table. But that is something that perhaps we can still control to a certain extent. But then we also have other complications like bad weather, which we cannot control. We have got monsoon, usually during the second half of the year towards the northern Asia, which we also cannot control. And of course, we do see a little bit of a trend that potentially, usually, in China, during the last quarter, there's also heavy port congestions that we need to manage. And of course, occasionally we do see some port strikes in different parts of the world. And if our product comes from that particular port, that's where a lot of active intervention will need to go in. So I hope I have given a little bit of how complicated the chain could be.
Okay.
Yes, it's surprising that we actually get the food that we eat.
Yeah, Kelly, so given there's so much that can go wrong, I mean, what are some of the key intervention actions that we can take to mitigate all these multiple threats to getting our food on the table?
Exactly. So in the previous slide, I actually said about how complicated, how things could go wrong. So what should logistics people do, or what are the supply chain folks doing actually out there just to make sure all of us have food on our table? We go back to my 10 cycle, a 10-step cycle. I would say that the key here is active intervention. We do not wait for things to happen. Time is not on our side. Conditions are usually not on our side. So it's about being active in every single step that we are doing. I try to break it down into 5 different ways that we can look at it. I think alternative sourcing is a very, very big thing, especially for the Singapore market. We are so small. We don't have control over where we can import. It's really a seller's market as well as the conditions of the rest of the market. So if there is another big country that can buy in like an even bigger bowl, or they can like consume everything that comes from a particular plantation or a particular association, then Singapore will have no chance to buy from that particular source. So alternate sourcing is a big thing, I would say, in supply chain active intervention, at least for the Singapore food chain. Today, we actually import products from 170 different countries. So that is really, yeah, and we hear that from the second episode of this series. So it is really a very active part on Singapore government as well as all the supply chain players to make sure that we do have alternate sourcing. And of course, I mentioned about the different conditions earlier, like port strikes, bad weather, monsoon, congestions. So there is a need to ensure that we do have multiple sourcing routes, where certain routes that we are used to, that we always go for, is not available or not accessible during specific times of the year. And of course, in supply chain, we always talk about risk pooling, which is the concept of sharing inventory with nearby markets. That's not always possible, but where possible, we do try to do that. Singapore, Malaysia, Indonesia, Thailand, while different, do have similar food requirements. So in one of the companies that I was consulting in, they do a little bit of a food sharing, if possible. So we try to do a little bit of a ASEAN inventory mitigation. And of course, in terms of just a market on its own, right, I would think that inventory buffer is really, really important, especially for Singapore, where we import, I don't know, 80% of the food that we are consuming today. We do need to have a buffer within our own warehouse in country before the next incoming shipment comes. And of course, last but not least, is about how to responsibly as well as effectively dispose of any bad products or any excess products that we have. It is unavoidable that we do have some waste. I think like what Tim mentioned, the target is really to reduce that. But if we do have, how do we end up disposing it in a responsible manner?
Right. Thanks, Kelly. So, you know, not just looking at it from maintaining what we currently do, but also looking at ways to improve it. Yeah. So we have a question. We have a whole bunch of questions, and it's very interesting. Today we've got participants all the way from Sydney to Tanzania. That's really, really cool. And it's hard to imagine. I was just in Tanzania for a few weeks in January, and it's hard to imagine that we're still in 2020 with all the travel restrictions, etc., etc. So here's one for you, Tim. How will climate change and all the natural disasters that ensue affect the kind of logistical challenges you talked about: production, transport, storage of food, etc., etc.?
Yeah. I think in particular for the tropical areas in the world, which would include Southeast Asia, you know, we're going to see, the emergence of like more extreme weather patterns, which can flood out entire communities. And we've already seen this occurring in our world, especially in our more tropical region of it. In terms of logistics, to your point, I think the ability to increase the diversity, the options for storage, to increase the infrastructure routes, to move things from one area to another, or in our way as well, we're going to have to see how we can as well start to change where things are even planted, you know, what crops are grown where. And we see this as a huge problem, I think, in facing our generation and definitely the next generation. For instance, you have areas of the desert in Pakistan, which is growing cotton, you know, the most thirsty plant you could have devised to put in a desert is cotton, you know. And, you know, that is leaching the soil tremendously, has to be continued by artificial means of, you know, bringing fertilizer in from all sorts of places in the world in order for this cotton to keep growing there, you know. But in general, why have we established that cotton is going to grow in the desert, you know? and we have to really think better about what crops are grown where, and we have to be able to somehow incentivize growing those crops in different places. We have, and a lot of this is going to be, I think, mentioned when you're talking about sustainability.
But here, so just to change gears a bit, because you want to talk about People are talking about nearshoring
Yeah,
and growing crops in the right place, using that as an example. And we've got
correct.
the 30 by 30 initiative here in Singapore. So Sun BB has a question. In terms of food resilience, do you really see high-tech production of food as a possible solution for Singapore? Do you think that 30 by 30 initiative, and this is
I
open to
do.
both Kelly and yourself, yeah? Because we've talked
Yeah.
about it before at our previous sessions. Do you think that's a reality?
I
that can be
definitely think
achieved?
that is like definitely important, because then especially you're having an ability in more of an urban environment even to grow crops. As we see, so much of the planet has been changed into urban environments, not only Singapore. If Singapore is developing this for Singapore to develop those technologies, to grow local, especially perishable products, like Kelly was mentioning, the waste is happening primarily with perishable products, which is a no-brainer, right? And to get rid of the kilometers from where it's grown to where it's going to be consumed is key, to eliminating that waste. And I think technology is going to be very, very important. They're even doing this in Los Angeles and things like that for certain crops. They're doing this in Europe, where they don't have, they have such seasons, but people want to eat salad in the wintertime. So they can grow the salad in the wintertime instead of having to, drag it from the tropical area and having half of it lost in transit. They can grow it locally. So I think this localization is going to be very important, not only for our generation as we grow older, but for the next generations. They really have an ability to use technology to get things grown a lot easier. They've made so many advances. I saw on one, and maybe it's controversial to mention cannabis, but cannabis production, generally in California would have like two crops a year, but with under artificial lights and using the light bandwidth, which feeds plants optimally at different times. They can have up to 5 crops in a year. So it's a totally different ball game, when you're talking about yields and getting greater yields. And I think it's extremely important.
So here's a follow-on question.
Resilience.
So here's a follow-on question there, Tim.
Yeah.
If you talk about higher yields, and if you look at it from a sustainability perspective, can you meet your sustainability objectives at the same time de-risking the food supply chain if you want to have higher yields? How's that for a curveball?
No. I mean, I think that is a perfect kind of question. I think that all society really needs to start asking this question, or not necessarily asking the question. They need to actually start putting policies in place that make sense, right? And generally that's done through government, because you have to make the playing field equal for all the producers, but by right, as Kelly was mentioning, diversification of your source for food is very important, as well as certification comes into that. When she was pointing to halal, halal is a type of certification, but we don't really have a proper certification for sustainably grown products. Governments don't want to touch it. It becomes like NGOs trying to create these certification mechanisms outside of government, and as a result, we have in our own grocery stores, we have a lot of products which are unsustainably produced and generally cheaper alongside sustainably produced products, and with maybe a little logo on the bottom right corner of the back of the package, and allowing and expecting that consumers are just going to boycott everything that is not sustainable or how they can figure it out has not worked. That has been kind of like the food industry's argument for many years. Well, we just give it them, it's their choice. But,
but
as
it's
a
so
society,
hard making that.
yeah, it's so hard to make that choice.
Yeah, because if I can buy this cabbage for $2 cheaper than something that's grown sustainably, I'm going to buy. It's going to be hard making that choice to buy think sustainable, think green, etc., etc.
Correct. I mean, a perfect example I saw, like at the fair price, there's Polish eggs. We have eggs just slamming into Singapore from Poland, and I can buy 36 Polish eggs for $2. I mean, I'm sorry, 4 Singapore dollars for 36 Polish eggs, okay? I mean, how is that possible, right? Then from Malaysia, I can buy my, cage-free, sustainably made eggs. I can buy 6 for $3.25,
Yeah, it's a tough one.
Yeah, who is rewarded here, at the grocery store? Basically I have probably, well, I know it's EU subsidized egg production from Poland, basically EU tax money going into paying these people to make eggs and make as many eggs as they possibly can. And then that is competing in your store down the street here in Singapore, a world away. And it's like, okay, there's something wrong with that, with this, the way that we have things set up.
Okay. All right. Tim, I believe you alluded to this in your slides, but what are some of the perhaps newer technologies, some of the newer best practices that can be deployed to bolster the food supply chain?
I do think, like one was alluding to in terms of like getting yields, high yield production for perishable goods in urban environments. I think, what they're doing with using different frequencies of light, like for instance, red light or blue light for different days, times of the growing patterns. They're making really great advances with that. Singapore itself has done a lot with trying to spread out how to get enough light to all the plants and in these conveyor belt systems to get the plants. But especially in Southeast Asia, we see, and in our talks over the last month with the logistics groups, we could hear a lot of agribusinesses which buy their products from smallholder producers. One of their chief complaints is there's too much low yield. We don't get enough yield out of these farmers that we partner with. We can give them advice on what to do, but seemingly we're just not getting the yield out of what we expect. So increasing yield can be done. And there's a lot of technologies being done with that. Like I think Kelly was mentioning in a meeting last week where there was drones being used to, give better maps for areas where you can see which areas are going to hold water better than other areas. So you can change your irrigation systems to highlight areas which have less, let's say, water retention than other areas.
Here's a question though, Tim and Kelly as well. Feel free to interject. There's so much that needs to be done, right? Sustainable sourcing, sustainable farming, nearshoring, etc., etc. Kelly, you had that whole spaghetti diagram. So we have actually a question from one of our participants. Alternate food sources, increasing on onshore storage locations, fresh farming, and many, many more. So these are all adding complexities in the supply chain. Who in the supply chain will need to take these initiatives? Is it the brand owners, the importers, or should we rely on government policies and protocols? In Singapore, we know we've got a lot of government intervention in a lot of things that we do. But what about it? What about in ASEAN, going outside of Singapore, or even globally? Who's responsible for this? Who wants to take that one, Tim or Kelly?
I'll let Kelly.
I can take this one. I think it has to be a half-half. For example, to increase food storage capabilities of a country, I think that has to be pretty much a government initiative to allocate land for it, to make sure that the infrastructure around the plot of land that is dedicated for food chain or for cold chain is being developed. But I would say that a lot of businesses in a perfect marketplace, there will be demand for it. So it's how each of the business try to optimize within their own profit and loss kind of situation to make sure that they can actually meet the demand of the customers.
Yeah, I mean,
Okay.
I would agree with Kelly in that, you know, it has to be, there should be a partnership generally between government and businesses in this case, because we have in the history of the world horrendous examples of government-led agricultural production, you know, so and those wound up in huge tragedy. So I mean, if we want to talk about producing enough food for everybody, then by right you have to have that private hands do it. In terms of getting a good yield and to efficiently move to the crops that are needed. You know, I think that is really critical. But that said, governments need to step in and create the playing field. And if there's infrastructure necessary, if they truly want to have resilience, then they need to understand that feeding your people is very important, and they need to maybe help out the financing for when it's needed to create that infrastructure.
So it's got to be a private-public partnership. It's not just public or it's not just private that's responsible for it. We have to work hand in hand, yeah?
I
So
think
we do have
strengths. That's all I'm saying. Yeah, their strengths are very different.
So I don't know if you've been following the chat. Someone's asking, does ASEAN, for example, what's our approach towards waste management generated through the food supply chain? Do any of you panelists have a comment on that? I see you laughing there, Tim.
Maybe Raymond, you could probably chime in on this one.
Yeah, well, I'll say I really don't think there is. You know, ASEAN as a whole is probably not as effective as it could be in pushing any initiative. I mean, even if you look at where we are with RCEP, for example, the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, is pushed back further and further. It's getting diluted more and more. So I really don't think ASEAN's at the able to actually have that systematic approach towards waste management through the food supply chain. I think there's so many lower hanging fruit that they can handle or address, and even that's not being addressed.
Yeah.
We have, yes, thanks, Tim. So we have heaps of comments here, also about us living through this perfect storm, climate change, pandemics. It seems there's a lack of a global strategy of our species. The World Health Organization, United Nations, etc., being undermined by nationalists. And we even go so far as to say which countries. Any thoughts on this from any of our
name
panelists?
Names, man. Let's name names. Let's do it. No, and I think, yeah, it is a perfect storm. There's no doubt about it.
Yeah, I think it's going to be one that's hard to address. We've got a question from Kamjit here that's just come in. So with increasing organization and food sources moving further away as cities grow, expanding vertical indoor farming is being an increasingly important proposition that improves food supply chain resilience. But regulators are still behind the curve on this. Do you agree? What do you think, Tim, and what do you think as well, Kelly? Are our regulators behind the curve on this? In terms of urban farming.
That is a good question, yeah, because you know, I've actually seen, I don't know if we have, yeah, I mean, we're definitely going to have that kind of issue here in Singapore as well, because especially the more urban you get, the more you get into zoning. And, you know, by and large in rural areas, zoning is not much of an issue. You know, people, if they buy land, they tend to do whatever they want with that land. There's not too much quibble about it, but I would agree. Regulation is actually an additional, maybe can be a bigger hurdle if you want to do more urban growing, just because of the fact that, oh, well, you're not supposed to grow on that property, or I can't even accept that as, you know, vegetables to eat because that was grown on an area that was supposed to be used for residential purposes, you know. So no, that is something that probably has to be addressed, but it's locality to locality. I've even seen, like in Canada, Toronto doesn't allow a lot of urban growing in some suburbs, but other suburbs they can do it, other areas they can. And it's just getting updated. I think a lot of the regulations need to update with urban farming being the new norm. They have to maybe take that approach.
There's still a lot that needs to be done.
Yeah. Maybe add to this point, right? Unless they are big scale of a specific type of farming or a specific type of food production process, I don't think the regulators are quick. I think purposefully, I don't think they do want to put in a lot of regulations. Today, what they are doing is really to measure the outcome. So if you're going to put your food into the commercial market, they will do samplings, they will do microorganisms count, they will check your facilities, they will do unannounced audits. So I think they are really looking at more of the outcome rather than the process. So I think for the process, unless you are big farmers, like for example, the egg juice corporation that we heard in the second session, yes, then the government comes in and put in regulations on how do you need to dispose your waste, what kind of area you can use, what kind of, I don't know, infrastructure you need to make sure is available within your properties. But other than that, I think the regulators in Singapore today is really more concerned of the outcome, which is the actual food safety itself.
Right. Yeah. Okay. Well, here's a question. The last question I'm going to ask you before I throw both of you back to Bob to wrap up. This is probably going to pick on your DHL experience, since both of you started by saying that you used to work for DHL back in the day.
Yes.
And this is from Mission Samuel. Yeah. A manager is required to achieve distribution lead time in a cost-effective manner, so that his organization maintains a robust pool of satisfied customers, but his organization depends on overseas support for her broken down electric forklift in her warehouse. How do you balance this? You've got your KPIs, but you've got to run an efficient operation, but you've got a situation that's beyond your control. Pray?
It sounds like that sounds like a general frustration question. Yeah.
Tim, do you want to take that question, or I can take that
yeah,
question?
I imagine you might have had broken forklifts at some point. Maybe you can answer that.
So I think there's a few things that you can do. Okay, there are certain equipments in the warehouse that we deem as absolute essentials. So I think it is a penny wise, pound foolish situation to not have a backup. So for some of this, yes, while you're trying to maintain costs, some of the very essentials, MHEs, the material handling equipments, you do need to have a backup. But if you don't, another method that a lot of warehouses do is to have different storage systems. With different storage systems, you actually use different material handling equipments, and therefore you do not rely on a single type of equipment to manage your inventory. You do have a little bit of lead time to assess your product from another storage type. Yes, you may be a little bit out of order in terms of your first expiry, first out, but you still maintain your customer service level to the customers. Of course, the third method is, again, alternate sourcing, right? So are there similar MHE that you can use that is probably nearer to shore, nearer to market, where you can use in concurrent to maybe the world-class MHE that you already have. So having multiple suppliers for your MHE is probably just as important as having multiple suppliers for food.
Thanks, Kelly. Back to you, Bob.
Yes, thank you, Rowan. And nice to see so many questions this morning. And we will get back to you on the ones we couldn't answer just now. So as we go into our final question, as we wrap up, of course, this year's big story is COVID. And they say never waste a good crisis. There's certainly been some crisis. But I wonder, are there some specific lessons that we can use that can be applied, to help ensure what we're looking for, which is this resilient food supply chain? So lessons from COVID. Kelly.
I would like to leave this with the audience. I think in the past, assured supplies, or what we call the business continuity plan, which is BCP, is usually an annual drill or somewhat a paper play. But with COVID, I think the BCP has now become the new norm. We really dig very hard to find that set of documents to say, what happens if my staff cannot come to work? What happens if I need to split my team into two? What happens if someone is down and the people that's around it has to be quarantined for 14 days? How is business going to continue? What kind of internet connectivity we have with our staff? How many people can actually do remote working? So all this used to be just addressed in the BCP. But now it becomes a real life business scenarios that we need to live through every day. So I think it's making sure that our BCP today is in place, is practical, and is executable.
Okay, yes, BCP. Tim.
Yeah, I think from my side, I think the COVID as an event basically has brought to the surface, I think, a lot of the weaknesses that were probably which were already there, present in our food supply chain. And one of them being is basically the low value that people have really placed on the essential workers that are growing our foods and moving our foods. It's even still in a lot of news that I see today. All the essential workers, the only one they're really going to talk about is the nurses, people basically cleaning up the result of the problem. And it's not talking about the people that are putting food on your table. These are essential workers, you know. And I think if anything, one of the lessons we have to take away from this is that, you know, people involved with food, putting food on your table, are extremely essential.
Yeah.
And that means give them protection in the workplace, give them and allow them to do their jobs. And that is very critical. A second point also that I think this crisis has really made obvious is that the market structures which move the food from the farm onto our table were in many respects very inflexible. So, and only now everybody over the last 3 months has figured out new websites and new, and people have come up with all sorts of different ways to move food to our table. But, you know, the farmers in a lot of instances, they only had one person they were selling to, or one guy that was going to pick up from them. And that guy doesn't have any orders from restaurants anymore because restaurants are closed. So nobody's picking up. And the food just sits there and dies. It wastes. It just goes to nothing. And so I think one of the strengths that has come out of COVID is that we have, as a society, as a people, figured out ways to move food from the farm to people at home in different ways other than just the same traditional inflexible way. And I think that will hopefully as well allow for farms to have more security themselves in terms of what I sell my products at, and increasing the number of options that they have to sell their products.
Okay,
So-
thank you. Ramon, I believe we have one more question that you'd like to ask.
Well, we have a question all the way from Shah Alam in Malaysia about halal food. So for Kelly and Tim, yeah, either one. What's the impact of meeting specific customer needs, example, the halal food consumers, ensuring halal supply chain, halal logistics, and how are these met in this pandemic? Any thoughts on that?
I would really have to defer to Kelly on this one since I'm not an expert on the halal chain.
I think with or without the pandemic, well, as far as operations are concerned or supply chain personnel are concerned, we treat this as a normal process. So we have a process which is a non-halal logistics, the non-halal food chain, and then we have the same mirror image, but just for halal. So we essentially duplicate our supply chain systems and the supply chain processes. We could do that maybe even for vegetarians, like you make sure that the entire chain does not come into contact with any meat and dairy products. But with the pandemic, if the normal food chain has gone a lot more complicated, so has the halal food chain. Like what I've mentioned before, it's more of restricted selling routes. So even though we have the sauce, maybe we could bring it to the consumer. It could be monsoon. So even we have the sauce, again, we can't bring it to the table. So I would say that the complications with halal as well as the non-halal has amplified with the pandemic because of the constraint in the resources that's available today.
Makes sense. Thanks, Kelly.
Yeah, thank you. So we are out of time. And I trust you've enjoyed this as much as I have. And certainly I've learned a lot from our two experts, Tim, Foote, and Kelly. So it's time to say goodbye. I want to thank also everybody who has joined not only this webinar, but the whole series of Cargo Now and CILT webinars. And I forgot to thank my co-host, Ramon. So of course, big thanks to Ramon as well. And with that, I want to say goodbye. Thank everyone again and see you again soon. Goodbye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.